before the meeting even began. He had my usual seat at the head of the conference table, slid 2 places down, beside the junior analysts. My nameplate was gone. In its place sat a glossy folder labeled Modernization Roadmap. He didn't whisper, "Emily, we appreciate your service, but we don't build the future with outdated caution." That was how 23 years ended. The funny thing is, the air in that room felt colder than the weather forecast outside. What's the temperature where you live? And if you're still here with me, leave your lucky number in the comments. Let's see who dares to brave this cold. My name is Emily Harper. I've served as Chief Risk and Crisis Director for over 2 decades. I stabilized 3 federal reviews, navigated 2 liquidity shortages that nearly pushed us into bankruptcy, and negotiated the legal settlement that kept this company alive when regulators were ready to make an example of us. Today, I was reframed as structural drag. Jason is 38 venture-backed, media-polished, freshly installed as CEO, and already calling himself a velocity upgrade. He says investors reward bold leadership. He says my crisis management style reflects fear-based thinking. He says fear is expensive. Then he delivers the update like it's a product launch. My authority is revoked. My oversight framework is dissolved. My risk control thresholds are under modernization review. 7-3. The vote passes smoothly. No one looks directly at me. I fold my hands to keep them steady. Anger would have been convenient for them, proof that I was emotional, resistant, obsolete, before I stand. I ask calmly, "Have you reviewed the 2012 Federal Consent Agreement?" Jason smiles without blinking. "We're not governed by ghosts." Polite laughter ripples around the table. Compliance memory, apparently, is superstition. I don't argue, because the most dangerous executives aren't reckless. They're certain. As I walk out, I notice something small but unmistakable. General Counsel won't look at Jason. That's when I recognize it. The first crack. What follows is a blend of workplace reality and fictional, dramatic elements, powered by artificial intelligence for storytelling and educational purposes. It doesn't focus on any specific individual or company. I hope you will continue to listen and stay by my side throughout this time. Humiliation didn't end in that boardroom. It went public. Jason didn't simply replace me. He dismantled what he called Harper-era friction at the company town hall. Under bright lights and louder applause, he declared, "We're done operating like we're on probation." The room responded the way rooms often do when confidence sounds like courage. Junior staff clapped. The compliance team did not. He eliminated the transaction gating protocol tied directly to our old settlement framework. To him, it was redundant architecture. To me, it was the firewall that kept us solvent. 12 years earlier, a regulatory violation had nearly cost us $210 million. The federal agreement that followed required structured reporting triggers, clear thresholds, mandatory escalations, documented oversight. My protocol operationalized those triggers. It wasn't decorative. It was contractual. Jason called it excessive caution. 3 months before I was removed, I sent him a memo, subject structural safeguards and settlement exposure. I outlined how altering the control framework could constitute a material deviation under the agreement. He never replied. Now those safeguards were gone. The applause faded. The emails didn't. That evening, a compliance analyst sent me a private message. They removed the reporting mechanism tied to the settlement clause. There was no panic in the text, just confusion. They didn't understand what they had dismantled. I did, and for the first time since the vote, I felt something steadier than anger. I felt containment. The first violation didn't arrive with alarms. It arrived quietly. A high-volatility contract cleared underwriting that afternoon without review. Under my old system, it would have triggered automatic escalation Tier 3 exposure, structured derivatives exposure, mandatory secondary sign-off. Now it passed in seconds. Approved by an algorithm recalibrated for speed. Projected upside looked impressive. Embedded downside did not. Risk exposure $74 million in contingent liability if counterparties defaulted under stress conditions. No internal red flag. No escalation email. No compliance queue. Just silence. Under the 2012 Federal Consent Agreement. However, structural safeguards were required to remain materially consistent. That phrase, materially consistent, had taken 6 weeks of negotiation to define. It meant threshold controls, reporting triggers, and documented review layers could not be weakened without regulatory acknowledgement. Jason's modernization removed 2 of the 3. Quarterly compliance certification was due at the end of the week. That afternoon, internal governance documents were updated to reflect my departure and the revised reporting structure. The filing language described organizational realignment and efficiency enhancements. Technically accurate, there was still no public market reaction, just paperwork. But the certification statement still affirmed that internal structural safeguards remained intact under the 2012 framework. They did not. The operational reality no longer matched the legal representation. That gap was small in wording, it was enormous in consequence, because once submitted, those certifications were reviewed not just by auditors, but by federal oversight staff assigned specifically because of our prior violation. I didn't have access to the internal portal anymore. I didn't need it. The settlement terms were memorized. Late that evening, compliance documents were transmitted. Nothing dramatic happened. No headlines, no trading halt, just data entering a federal system. Then something subtle shifted. An inquiry email was sent back to the company requesting clarification on material changes to reporting mechanisms referenced in prior compliance correspondence. It wasn't public. It wasn't accusatory. It was procedural. But I recognized the tone. Regulators don't begin with threats. They begin with questions. And when the questions start before the quarter even closes, it means someone noticed. That was the moment the silence stopped feeling stable. It started feeling loaded. By late afternoon, the shift moved from internal tension to controlled alarm. The public filing was released before market close. The language was clean. Almost antiseptic chief risk officer has departed. No successor named. No transitional oversight structure outlined. Just a vacancy where institutional memory used to sit. Technically, it was disclosure compliance. Strategically, it was exposure. At first, nothing dramatic happened. Trading remained steady. Analysts noted the update, but waited, internally. However, emails began circulating. Institutional desks wanted clarification. A few portfolio managers asked whether risk oversight would be replaced or absorbed into finance. By sunset, the stock slipped 4.2%, not a collapse. A question. Jason appeared on a financial news segment that evening, relaxed and smiling. "This is a necessary correction," he said. "We're evolving beyond legacy constraints." He framed it as strategic maturity, efficiency over bureaucracy, innovation over caution. But markets don't react to tone. They react to pattern recognition. Overnight, analysts began connecting the sequence. Removal of risk oversight leadership. Modification of structural safeguards. A federal consent agreement still legally active. Those 3 variables did not align comfortably. Investor relations reported a spike in inbound calls before the next trading session even opened. Long-term institutional holders requested written clarification regarding continuity of compliance controls. One fund, holding over 10% of outstanding shares, asked directly whether the 2012 settlement framework had been altered. An emergency board call was scheduled for the following morning. Externally, this still looked contained. No headlines, no downgrade, no crisis. Internally, the legal team had stopped using the word modernization. Then the second shift occurred. The federal oversight inquiry that had begun as a request for clarification was formally reclassified. What had been procedural language was now labeled review status. It wasn't public yet, but review status meant documentation, audit trails, and potential supervisory involvement. Jason insisted it was administrative noise. I recognized it as trajectory. Controlled alarm doesn't scream. It tightens. And once regulators begin escalating language before markets fully understand the risk, the timeline compresses. That night, the panic hadn't arrived, but it had been scheduled. After those warning signals, do you think the real cracks are about to split wide open? If you do, leave a 1 in the comments, because your voice matters more than you realize, and sometimes the sharpest insight comes from the ones watching closely. By the time the board convened again, the tone had shifted from confidence to calculation. General Counsel spoke first. Not emotionally, not defensively. Precisely. Yes, she confirmed, sliding a copy of the 2012 consent agreement across the table. The structural safeguards were binding conditions under the settlement. She paused just long enough for it to register. No, they were not discretionary. The distinction landed heavily. Jason leaned forward, hands clasped, voice steady. He framed the changes as modernization efficiency upgrades, operational streamlining, removal of redundant oversight layers. He argued that the agreement required compliance outcomes, not identical mechanisms. It was a clever defense. It was also incomplete, because the agreement's language didn't merely reference outcomes, it referenced structural consistency, specific triggers, documented reporting layers, mandatory escalation protocols, and those had been altered. One of the independent directors requested my archived memo. It was projected onto the screen. The subject line appeared without commentary: structural safeguards and settlement exposure. The timestamp was visible. 3 months before my removal. The language was clear. I had outlined that dismantling the transaction gating protocol could constitute a material deviation from the settlement framework and trigger supervisory scrutiny. There was no emotion in the memo, no accusation, just analysis. The room went quiet in a different way than before. Not dismissive, not amused, measured. Legal realization doesn't explode. It settles. Jason attempted to redirect. He suggested that internal teams may have overcorrected during implementation. He implied miscommunication. He hinted that my memo had been overly conservative, but no one interrupted General Counsel when she added, "The regulator's review status indicates they believe the change may be substantive." That word substantive altered posture around the table. Then the second fracture appeared. Investor Relations relayed that a major institutional holder, controlling 11% of outstanding shares, had formally requested a governance stability briefing in private correspondence. They stated they were evaluating whether continued exposure aligned with their risk mandate. It wasn't a sell-off, not yet. It was a warning, and boards understand warnings, because once institutional capital begins reconsidering position size, confidence becomes quantifiable. That afternoon, the debate was no longer about modernization, it was about liability. The pressure stopped being theoretical when the credit agencies moved. Late that week, one of the major rating firms placed the company on negative watch, citing governance uncertainty and potential compliance instability. It wasn't a downgrade yet, but markets treat watch lists like early tremors. You don't ignore them. You brace. Our revolving credit facility, the same one I had renegotiated during the liquidity scare years ago, included a compliance stability clause. If material regulatory exposure increased, lenders retained discretion to reassess access. They exercised it. Banks didn't terminate the line. They restricted draw capacity pending review. Technically procedural, practically suffocating. Liquidity reserves tightened overnight. Treasury teams began modeling cash scenarios in shorter windows, 90 days, then 60. I recognized the pattern. When time horizons shrink, confidence follows. By the end of the trading week, the stock was down 12% from the day of my departure disclosure. Not catastrophic, but directional. Jason went back on financial media. Posture unchanged. Legacy leadership created this panic. He said, "We're correcting inefficiencies that spooked traditionalists." He framed the volatility as narrative distortion. He suggested that cautious culture had overstated regulatory exposure. He implied that markets simply needed to adjust to stronger, faster governance. He blamed storytelling, But banks don't restrict credit over stories. They react to risk. Inside the board, tension stopped being philosophical. Directors began asking about covenant triggers. Treasury projections were requested daily instead of weekly. Legal circulated summaries of potential supervisory outcomes if the federal review deepened. It was still controlled. No emergency capital raise, no halted trading, just tightening. Then the next fracture arrived from outside. An activist investor, holding just under 5%, but known for aggressive campaigns, released a public letter questioning whether the board had exercised adequate oversight when structural safeguards were removed. The letter cited governance duty, regulatory exposure, and failure of risk stewardship. It was measured, it was strategic, and it was public. Once activist scrutiny enters the conversation, internal disagreements become external leverage. The system wasn't collapsing, it was compressing, and compressed systems don't fail gradually. They rupture when pressure finds its seam. The call came after market close, which told me it wasn't casual. Jason didn't open with courtesy. He opened with accusation. "You're coordinating this," he said. No greeting, no context. The activist letter, the regulator's timing, the investor pressure. "You set this in motion." His tone wasn't angry. It was controlled, like someone trying to negotiate with a threat he didn't fully understand. "I documented risk," I replied. "You dismantled it." Silence, brief and sharp. He shifted tactics. He implied that my prior warnings had been exaggerated, that I had cultivated fear inside the organization, that removing my framework had simply exposed how dependent the company had become on unnecessary restraint. "This company can't operate in constant caution." He said, "Your systems made us slow. My systems kept you compliant." I answered. He accused me of influencing former staff. I reminded him I no longer had internal access. He suggested that my archived memo had been written defensively. I pointed out it had been written months before my removal. Deflection requires volume. Facts require timestamps. Meanwhile, the board authorized an independent audit to assess whether structural changes had materially altered the consent agreement framework. The firm they retained was not sentimental. It specialized in post-regulatory exposure reviews. Their preliminary findings were clear. The removal of the transaction gating protocol and reporting triggers constituted a substantive modification to compliance architecture referenced in the 2012 settlement. Substantive. That word again. Jason attempted internal containment. He suggested mid-level implementation errors. He implied misinterpretation by operations. He framed it as an execution oversight rather than executive directive. But the governance minutes reflected otherwise. The board's confidence didn't collapse. It eroded. Directors began asking questions without looking at him first. Legal briefings grew longer. Investor correspondence was circulated in full, not summarized. Jason called me once more before the audit report was finalized. "You could help fix this," he said. I tried. I answered. The following morning, the board chair sent formal notice a confidence vote regarding executive leadership had been scheduled. Accusation had become arithmetic, and arithmetic doesn't negotiate. Collapse rarely sounds dramatic at first. It looks statistical. By the time the confidence vote approached, the stock had fallen 26% from the week I was removed. Not in one crash, just steady. Relentless erosion. Institutional capital outflows accelerated as funds rebalanced exposure. Some trimmed quietly. Others filed updated position disclosures that signaled reduced conviction. Liquidity modeling grew tighter. Treasury circulated revised cash forecasts every 48 hours. The federal review intensified from documentation requests to structured supervisory interviews. That shift alone changed tone inside the building. When regulators schedule interviews, they are no longer asking whether something happened. They are determining how it happened. The independent audit report was finalized 2 days before the vote. Its language was measured, but decisive. Executive-approved modifications had materially altered compliance safeguards referenced in the 2012 consent agreement. Governance oversight had failed to evaluate settlement continuity risk prior to structural change. No adjectives, just conclusion. The board convened in executive session without Jason present. Directors who had once applauded modernization now asked about exposure curves, supervisory penalties, reputational impact. The activist investors' letter had gained traction. Other institutional holders echoed governance concerns privately. The vote was conducted electronically. 8-2. Jason was removed as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. He hadn't anticipated it. I knew that because he had built his leadership narrative around disruption as immunity. In cultures obsessed with breaking rules, accountability is treated like a legacy constraint, but markets are indifferent to charisma. They price risk. When the announcement was released, the stock stabilized, not rebounding, just pausing. Sometimes removal itself becomes a form of reassurance. I expected silence after that. Instead, my phone rang. It wasn't Jason. It was the chair of the board. His voice carried neither apology nor celebration. "We need stability," he said. "And memory." The structure had fractured. Now they were looking for the blueprint they had discarded, and they knew exactly who had drawn it. Power feels different the second time. When the board chair called, he didn't offer apologies. He offered a position, interim director of risk stabilization, not chief risk officer, not a restoration of title, a mandate. The company needed containment before confidence could return. Federal review was ongoing. Credit restrictions were still partially in place. Institutional investors were watching governance signals as closely as earnings projections. I didn't answer immediately. Control means choosing timing. When I did respond, it wasn't emotional, it was conditional. "I will return," I said, "under 3 terms. First, public governance correction. The board would formally acknowledge that structural safeguards tied to the 2012 settlement had been altered without full risk assessment. No scapegoating, no revisionist narrative. Second, independent compliance oversight restored. Reporting lines would no longer flow exclusively through executive management. An external compliance monitor would be engaged to validate remediation. Third, full transparency regarding corrective measures, not marketing language operational disclosure. Investors would be informed of reinstated thresholds, escalation triggers, and supervisory coordination. The chair didn't argue. He asked for written terms. Within 48 hours, a revised governance framework was drafted. The press release described the prior leadership decision as a structural misjudgment affecting risk architecture. It avoided theatrics. It signaled recalibration. Markets don't reward regret, they reward correction. The announcement of my interim appointment was paired with confirmation that legacy compliance triggers would be reinstated pending regulatory review. Analysts adjusted language in their notes, instead of governance instability. Reports began using remediation underway. The stock didn't surge, it steadied. Credit desks signaled that restricted draw capacity could be reassessed once the federal review showed cooperative posture. Institutional investors paused further reductions. Inside the building, I didn't walk back into the boardroom like a returning hero. I walked in with binders. Reinstating transaction gating protocols required technical reconstruction. Rebuilding reporting triggers required cross-functional alignment. Documentation had to match operational reality before the next certification cycle. Power, when controlled, isn't loud, it's procedural. And procedure, properly restored, begins to quiet markets before headlines ever notice. This wasn't revenge. It was restoration under terms that couldn't be ignored. Restoration doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks procedural. The frameworks once dismissed as Harper-era friction were reinstated. Though not under my name, we relabeled them using neutral governance terminology, transaction integrity controls, structured escalation triggers, supervisory reporting alignment. Titles didn't matter. Continuity did. Documentation was rebuilt line by line to ensure operational reality matched regulatory certification. Independent compliance oversight resumed. reporting channels were clarified. Every safeguard tied to the 2012 consent agreement was mapped and verified against current systems. After remediation, evidence was submitted and validated. The federal review status was formally downgraded. Supervisory posture shifted from investigative to monitoring. Credit restrictions eased incrementally. Liquidity projections lengthened again. Jason resigned entirely within weeks. No press conference, no symbolic gestures, just a board notice stating leadership transition complete. There were no fireworks, just math. Stock stabilization followed structural correction. Institutional investors adjusted positions based on governance repair metrics, not personalities. Analysts updated outlooks once documentation aligned with risk disclosures. The lesson never required drama. Experience was never obsolete. Arrogance was, in the end. The system functioned because memory was restored. Archived memos remained preserved. Compliance protocols were re-anchored. Institutional knowledge, once dismissed as superstition, became the architecture again. Justice didn't arrive with celebration. It arrived with timestamps, revised filings, and reconciled language, and in governance. That's the only kind that lasts. What this experience taught me wasn't about winning a boardroom vote or watching a CEO fall. It taught me that documentation is power, restraint is strength, and memory is leverage. In corporate life, the loudest voice often gets the spotlight, but the most prepared mind survives the audit. I didn't fight back with outrage. I relied on records, timing, and clarity. That's not dramatic. It's durable. If you were in that room publicly dismissed, your work erased, what would you protect first, your pride or your proof? Real influence doesn't always look bold in the moment. Sometimes it looks like sending the memo anyway, keeping the file, knowing the clause, staying calm while others chase applause. I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Drop your city or state in the comments. It reminds me that these stories travel farther than any boardroom ever could. If this story made you think differently about experience, leadership, or accountability, consider subscribing. One subscription helps this channel keep telling stories that value preparation over ego. A like or share might reach someone who feels underestimated tonight. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.